There are two kinds of people in the world when it comes to money. The first kind wakes up every morning and goes to work. They trade their time for a paycheck. They earn, they spend, they earn again. At the end of the month, the money is gone and the cycle begins again. They are good people. They work hard, they do everything they were told to do, and they are, financially speaking, running on a treadmill that never stops and never takes them anywhere. The second kind wakes up every morning and the money is already working. While they slept, their assets generated income. While they rested, their investments compounded. While they lived their life, the financial systems they built continued operating, producing returns, building equity, accumulating wealth, without requiring their direct presence. The difference between these two kinds of people is not intelligence. It is not talent. It is not the neighborhood they grew up in, or the school they attended, or the luck of their early circumstances. The difference is a single fundamental understanding about how money works, an understanding that changes everything once it arrives, and that most people go their entire lives without ever fully grasping. This video is about that understanding, about the two sides of money that most people never see clearly, about why some people spend their entire working lives laboring for money, while others build systems that make money labor for them, and about what it actually takes, practically, psychologically, and structurally, to cross from one side to the other. We are going to go deep. We are going to look at the history, the neuroscience, the economics, and the real stories of people who made this crossing, from workers to owners, from employees to asset builders, from people who earned wealth to people who built it. By the time we are done, you will see money differently, not as something you earn and spend, as something you can deploy, accumulate, and put to work on your behalf for the rest of your life. Let us begin.
Chapter 1. The Two Financial Worlds, an invisible divide that most people never see. Most people live their entire financial lives in one world without ever knowing a second world exists. The first world is the world of earned income. You go to work, you perform labor or provide a service, you receive payment in proportion to your time and effort you invested. Stop working and the income stops. The relationship between your effort and your reward is direct, linear, and entirely dependent on your continued presence. This is the world most people inhabit. It is the world schools prepare students for. It is the world most parents model for their children. Get a good education, get a good job, work hard, earn a good salary, retire when you have worked long enough. There is dignity in this world. There is value in honest labor. I am not here to diminish it, but I want you to see clearly what this world cannot provide, regardless of how hard you work within it. The world of earned income has a structural ceiling. That ceiling is your time. Every human being has the same 24 hours in every day. Every hour you can sell has a maximum price, the highest hourly rate your skills command in the market. And the product of those two constraints, available hours multiplied by maximum rate, is the absolute ceiling of what earned income can produce. No matter how talented you are, no matter how hard you work, no matter how many raises and promotions you accumulate, if earned income is your only financial engine, you are mathematically capped. The second world is entirely different. In the second world, the relationship between effort and income is not linear. It is not even direct. In the second world, you build or acquire assets, things that have value independently of your presence and that generate income regardless of whether you are working, resting, or sleeping. In the second world, your financial output is not capped by your time because it is not dependent on your time. This is not a theoretical distinction. It is the actual structural difference that separates the financial outcomes of people who build significant wealth from those who do not. The research on this is clear and consistent. A study of American millionaires by Fidelity found that approximately 88% of them are self-made, first-generation wealthy, not inheritors. And the single most consistent characteristic of their wealth building was the ownership of assets that generated income independently of their direct ongoing labor. They crossed from the first world to the second, not by earning more, by building differently. Now, here is the question that matters. If the second world is accessible, if ordinary people cross into it every day without extraordinary luck or extraordinary talent, why do most people spend their entire lives in the first world? The answer is a combination of education, psychology, and the specific way most people were taught to think about money. And understanding that answer is the first step toward changing it.
Chapter 2. The Employment Trap. Why the paycheck keeps you safe and keeps you stuck. The paycheck is one of the most psychologically powerful financial instruments ever created. Not because of what it gives you, because of what it does to your thinking. When a paycheck arrives, reliably, on schedule, in a predictable amount, it creates a specific psychological state: security, certainty, the sense that the financial foundation beneath you is solid, and the brain, which is wired above all else to seek certainty and avoid threat, responds to that feeling with something like relief, like settling, like this is enough. This psychological response to regular employment income has been studied extensively in behavioral economics. It is related to what researchers call status quo bias, the preference for the current state of affairs over alternatives, regardless of whether the current state is actually optimal. The known is preferred over the unknown not because it is necessarily better, but because it is familiar, and familiar feels safe. The paycheck is the ultimate status quo financial instrument. It arrives, it is familiar, it relieves the anxiety of not knowing where the next payment comes from. And in doing so, it reduces the motivation to build something different. Because building something different requires tolerating uncertainty. And uncertainty, to a brain that just received a paycheck, feels unnecessary. This is the first mechanism of the employment trap. Not the job itself, the psychological comfort of the job. The way regular income reduces the urgency that might otherwise drive someone toward the harder, more uncertain work of building assets. The second mechanism is more structural. Employment income is taxed first, before you receive it. The government takes its share at the source, and what arrives in your account is already depleted. A person earning $60,000 in employment income in the United States, after federal income tax, state income tax, and payroll taxes, might take home $40,000 to $44,000, a reduction of 25% to 33% before they make a single financial decision. Business owners and asset holders operate under a fundamentally different tax relationship. They earn gross income, pay their business expenses, which are tax-deductible, and pay tax on what remains after those deductions. The sequence is earn, spend on the business, then pay tax on the remainder. The employee sequence is earn, pay tax first, then spend on living expenses from what remains. This difference in sequence, which sounds like a technical detail, produces dramatically different financial outcomes over a lifetime. The employee pays the highest possible tax rate on their income. The business owner and investors structure their affairs to minimize taxable income through legitimate deductions, depreciation, and capital gains treatment. This is not a conspiracy. It is an incentive structure. Governments want people to build businesses and create employment and invest in assets because these activities generate economic activity. So they made these activities more tax efficient than employment. Understanding this is not cynicism, it is financial literacy. The third mechanism of the employment trap is the most subtle and possibly the most powerful. It is the way employment income structures time. When your income comes from a job, your time belongs to someone else during working hours, 8 hours a day, 40 hours a week. The time during which you are most energetic, most cognitively available, most capable of focused creative work, that time is committed to producing value for an employer. The remaining time, evenings, weekends, the hours of genuine depletion, is what is left over for building anything of your own. Seriously, most people who successfully cross from the first world to the second do so in the margins of their employed time, in the evenings and early mornings and weekends, building the side business, the investment portfolio, the income-generating asset alongside the full-time job that pays the bills while the asset is being constructed. It is unglamorous, it is slow, it requires sustained effort in the hours when rest feels more reasonable. And it is precisely how most self-made wealth is actually built, not through a dramatic leap from employee to owner, but through a long, gradual, deliberate accumulation of assets built in the margins of an employed life.
Chapter 3. What an asset actually is, the definition that changes everything. The word asset is used so loosely in everyday conversation that its actual meaning, the meaning that matters for wealth building, has become blurred for most people. People describe their house as an asset, their car as an asset, their education as an asset, their wardrobe as an asset. And in a casual sense, these things have value. But in the specific, financially precise sense that matters for wealth building, most of these things are not assets at all. An asset, in the sense that matters here, is something that puts money in your pocket, not something that might sell for more in the future, not something that has value in some abstract sense, something that generates income for you right now, consistently, independently of your direct, ongoing labor. A rental property that produces monthly income above its costs is an asset. A stock portfolio that pays dividends is an asset. A business that operates without your daily presence and generates profit is an asset. Intellectual property, a book, a course, a patent, a piece of software that generates licensing income or royalties is an asset. A bond that pays regular interest is an asset. A house you live in is not an asset in this definition. It does not put money in your pocket. It takes money out in mortgage payments, in maintenance, in property taxes, in insurance. It may appreciate in value, it may eventually sell for more than you paid, but while you live in it, it is a liability dressed up in asset clothing. This reframe, understanding the precise distinction between assets and liabilities, is not a minor semantic adjustment. It is a complete reorganization of how you see every financial decision you make. If you understand that an asset is something that generates income independently of your labor, then every financial decision becomes evaluable through a single question. Does this put money in my pocket or take money out of my pocket? Does this move me toward the world of passive income or deeper into the world of earned income dependence? The wealthy, by and large, spend their money on assets. They acquire things that generate income. They build systems that produce returns. They deploy capital toward ownership of things that grow or pay. The financially struggling, by and large, spend their money on liabilities they describe as assets. The home that is mortgaged to the maximum, the car that depreciates the moment it leaves the lot, the luxury goods that carry zero income-generating potential, the consumption that feels like investment because it signals success. The gap between these two spending patterns, compounded over a working lifetime, is the wealth gap. It is not primarily an income gap, it is an asset allocation gap. Let me be specific about the asset categories most accessible to people at different income levels, because the objection I hear most frequently at this point is that assets require capital, and capital is what most people do not have. At the entry level, people beginning with limited or no savings, the entry-level asset class is fractional ownership of public equities through index funds. A broad market index fund purchased for as little as $1 on many modern platforms is ownership of a tiny piece of hundreds or thousands of companies. Those companies generate earnings. A portion of those earnings are distributed as dividends, the rest compound in the form of share price growth. This is asset ownership. It is available to anyone with a smartphone and $5. At the next level, people with some accumulated savings, dividend-paying stocks, real estate investment trusts, and peer-to-peer lending platforms provide income-generating asset exposure without requiring property ownership or large capital outlay. At higher capital levels, the goal toward which everything else builds, direct real estate ownership, business ownership, and significant investment portfolios provide the asset base that generates truly meaningful passive income. Thoughtfully, the journey from one level to the next is not quick. It is not dramatic. It is the quiet, consistent, decade-long accumulation of income-generating assets, reinvesting the income they generate to purchase more assets, until the asset base is large enough to produce a meaningful, independent income stream. Seriously, that is the journey. The destination is the second world. The path is asset accumulation, and it begins with the first dollar deliberately deployed toward ownership rather than consumption.
Chapter 4: The Invisible Curriculum. What the wealthy teach their children that schools never do. There is a curriculum being taught to the children of wealthy families right now. Not in any school, not in any formal institution, in the conversations around dinner tables, in the questions asked and answered during family financial decisions, in the early exposure to businesses and investments and ownership structures that shapes how a child comes to understand the relationship between effort and income. And there is an absence of curriculum being absorbed by most other children, not through malice or deliberate exclusion, but through the simple fact that you cannot teach what you do not know. Research on financial literacy transmission across generations is stark. Children who grow up in households where financial topics are discussed openly, where parents talk about investments, explain business decisions, involve children in age-appropriate financial conversations, demonstrate significantly higher financial literacy as adults, and make measurably better financial decisions throughout their lives. Not because they are more intelligent, because they received an education that most people never receive. The curriculum of the wealthy has specific content, and understanding what that content is, even if you did not receive it in childhood, is the beginning of acquiring it for yourself and for your own children. The first lesson of the wealthy curriculum is the distinction between earned and unearned income. Wealthy families teach their children early that there are two ways to receive money. You can work for it, trading time and effort for a wage or salary, or you can own something that works for you, an asset that generates income independently of your direct effort. The child who learns this early develops an entirely different relationship with money than the child who only learns that work produces income. The second lesson is the tax code as a tool rather than an obligation. Wealthy families understand that the tax code was written with specific incentives embedded in it. Incentives for business ownership, for investment, for asset development. A child who grows up watching a parent structure a business to capture available deductions, or who hears conversations about the difference between ordinary income and capital gains tax rates, or who is present when a family discusses the tax advantages of a real estate investment, that child absorbs a relationship with taxation that is strategic rather than passive. The third lesson is risk as a spectrum rather than a binary. Most working-class and middle-class families teach risk avoidance. Get a secure job, save in a safe account, do not gamble with your financial security. This is understandable. Financial precarity makes risk genuinely dangerous. But the unintended consequence is children who grow up equating all risk with the irresponsible risk of gambling, rather than the calculated, managed, informed risk of investment. Wealthy families teach that there is a spectrum of risk, that the risk of keeping all your money in a zero-interest savings account, the slow erosion of purchasing power through inflation, is as real as the risk of investment.
that the risk of never building assets, the permanent dependence on earned income that can disappear, is as real as the risk of an investment declining in value. Risk management, not risk avoidance, is the lesson. The fourth lesson is equity thinking. Wealthy families teach their children to think in terms of ownership, not just to receive income, but to own pieces of the things that generate income. Shares of companies, equity in businesses, ownership stakes in real estate. The habit of asking not just how do I earn from this, but can I own a piece of this, is a fundamentally different cognitive orientation toward economic activity. A child who grows up with this orientation does not look at a successful business and see only employment. They see equity. They see the possibility of ownership. They ask what it would take to have a stake in the growth rather than just a wage from the labor. These four lessons, earned versus unearned income, the tax code as a tool, risk as a spectrum, and equity thinking are not complicated. They do not require privileged circumstances to understand, but they require exposure. And for most people, the first exposure happens in adulthood, if at all. What I want you to understand is that receiving this education late does not diminish its value. The understanding available to a 30-year-old who genuinely internalizes these four principles is still capable of reshaping the next 40 years of their financial life. The compounding has less time to operate, but it still operates.
Chapter 7. The Four Asset Classes. A complete guide to the vehicles of the second world. Understanding what an asset is matters. Understanding specifically which assets are available to ordinary people at various stages of wealth accumulation matters even more, because the second world is not a single destination. It is a spectrum of ownership, from the simplest, most accessible entry point to the most sophisticated and highest returning structures. Let me walk you through the four primary asset classes that ordinary people use to build the second world income. Not all four will be appropriate for every person at every stage, but understanding all four gives you a complete map of the terrain. Asset Class 1. Public equities, fractional ownership of the world's businesses. When you purchase a share of a publicly traded company, you become a part owner of that company. Fractionally, yes, but genuinely. You own a claim on the company's assets, a right to a portion of its earnings, and a vote in its governance. The company generates revenue, pays its costs, and distributes a portion of the profit to shareholders in the form of dividends, income that arrives in your account without any corresponding labor on your part. The long-term historical average of the U.S. stock market, dividends plus price appreciation, is approximately 10% annually before inflation, approximately 7% after. Over long periods, this return has been remarkably consistent, despite the enormous volatility that exists in shorter timeframes. For most ordinary people, the most efficient vehicle for equity ownership is a broad market index fund, a single fund that holds fractional ownership in hundreds or thousands of companies simultaneously, eliminating company-specific risk through diversification and minimizing costs through passive management. The behavioral requirement of equity investing, the thing that separates the people who actually capture these long-term returns from those who do not, is patience. The market fluctuates, sometimes dramatically. People who sell during the fluctuations lock in losses. People who hold through the fluctuations and ideally continue purchasing during the downturns when prices are lower capture the full long-term return. Asset Class 2. Real estate. Income and equity from physical property. Real estate investment offers two distinct return streams that, in combination, make it one of the most reliable wealth-building vehicles available. The first is rental income, cash flow generated by tenants paying for the use of the property. The second is equity appreciation, the increase in the property's market value over time. In addition to these two return streams, real estate offers significant tax advantages in most jurisdictions. Mortgage interest is often deductible. Depreciation, a non-cash accounting expense, can offset rental income for tax purposes.
Capital gains on property held long-term are often taxed at lower rates than ordinary income. For people who cannot yet afford direct property ownership, real estate investment REITs, or REITs, provide a pathway to real estate income without requiring a down payment or property management responsibilities. REITs are publicly traded companies that own income-producing real estate and are required by law to distribute at least 90% of their taxable income to shareholders as dividends. They trade like stocks and can be purchased for the price of a single share. Asset Class 3, Business Ownership, the highest returning and most complex asset class. A business, structured as a genuine system rather than as self-employment, is the asset class with the highest potential return and the highest degree of active involvement required to build. It is not passive in the construction phase, but once built, once the business operates with systems, processes, and people that do not require the owner's direct daily presence, it becomes an income-generating asset of the highest order. The multiple applied to business earnings when a company is sold, typically 4 to 10 times annual earnings for small businesses and significantly higher for scalable or technology businesses, means that a business generating $100,000 annually in profit might sell for $400,000 to $1 million. The act of building a business is simultaneously the act of building a highly valuable asset. The path to business as asset rather than business as job requires a specific and deliberate focus on systemization, building processes that operate without the owner, training people to perform functions the owner currently performs, creating documentation, automation, and infrastructure that allow the business to run in the owner's absence. This is harder than it sounds and takes longer than most people expect. But it is the work that converts a job you own into an asset you own. Asset Class 4, Intellectual Property, income from what you know and create. Intellectual property is the most overlooked and, in the digital age, the most accessible of the 4 major asset classes. A book, a course, a piece of software, a patent, a recorded piece of music or educational content, a brand. These are assets that can generate income repeatedly, indefinitely, from a single creative or intellectual effort. The economics of intellectual property have been transformed by digital distribution. A book written once can sell indefinitely without additional authorial effort. A course recorded once can be purchased by students worldwide without the instructor's ongoing presence. A YouTube channel built with consistent quality content can generate advertising revenue from videos published years ago. This asset class has zero geographic barrier, zero inventory requirement, and effectively zero marginal cost of distribution in digital form. The investment required is time, knowledge, and creative effort, resources available to far more people than the capital required for real estate or equity investment. One important caveat: intellectual property as an income-generating asset requires genuine value creation. Content that exists only to exploit search algorithms without providing real substance does not build a durable asset. The intellectual property that compounds, that generates income for years or decades, is the kind built on genuine expertise, genuine helpfulness, and genuine quality. There is no shortcut past this requirement.
Chapter 8. The Psychology of Ownership. Why most people never buy assets even when they can. We have established what assets are. We have established which ones are available. We have established that ordinary people at modest income levels can begin acquiring them. So why do most people not do it? The answer is not primarily financial. Most people who could begin building asset income do not because the math does not work, not because the vehicle is inaccessible, because of a set of psychological barriers that are rarely named clearly and almost never addressed directly. The first barrier is the consumption identity. Most people experience money primarily as a consumption instrument. Money arrives, it gets converted into things: food, shelter, clothing, entertainment, experiences.
This is the primary financial identity of most adults in the consumer economy, and that identity makes investment feel like an interruption of the natural order. Money is for spending. Putting it into an investment account feels like removing it from the world of the real and placing it into something abstract and distant. This is related to what behavioral economists call mental accounting, the tendency to treat money differently based on what mental category it occupies. Money in a checking account feels available, present, ready to be deployed toward life. Money in an investment account enters a different mental category, one associated with the future, with restriction, with sacrifice. The same dollar, in a different account, feels psychologically inaccessible in a way that profoundly reduces the motivation to put it there. The identity shift required is from money as consumption to money as capital, not eliminating consumption, that would be neither possible nor desirable, but developing a genuine felt sense that some portion of every dollar that arrives is not spending money. It is seed corn. It is capital waiting for its deployment. It belongs to the future building project rather than to the present consumption project. The second barrier is the complexity illusion. Investing feels complicated to most people. The language, equities, derivatives, yield curves, price-to-earnings ratios, asset allocation is opaque, and the media coverage of financial markets is dramatic and confusing, oscillating between euphoria and catastrophe in ways that suggest specialized knowledge is required to navigate safely. The financial services industry has, in many respects, a commercial incentive to maintain this impression of complexity, because complexity justifies fees. The actual knowledge required to build a wealth-generating investment portfolio through index funds is approximately what can be absorbed in 5 hours of focused reading. The complexity of advanced investment strategy is real. The complexity of the basic, evidence-backed approach that most individual investors should actually use is minimal. The barrier is not knowledge, it is the perception of knowledge as a barrier. The third barrier is loss aversion in the context of investment risk. As we discussed in the previous video, humans feel the pain of financial loss at approximately twice the intensity of the pleasure of equivalent gain. In the context of investment, this asymmetry produces a specific and destructive pattern. The potential downside of an investment, the possibility of losing money, feels psychologically larger than the equally real upside potential. And so people systematically underinvest, choosing the psychological comfort of holding cash over the financial advantage of deploying capital into assets. The irony is that this behavior intended to avoid loss actually guarantees a specific kind of loss. Inflation, the gradual erosion of purchasing power over time, is a reliable, consistent, ongoing loss that applies to cash held in low-interest accounts. A person holding $50,000 in cash at zero interest, while inflation runs at 3% annually, loses $1,500 of purchasing power in the first year, $3,000 in the second, and so on. The loss is invisible and gradual rather than sharp and sudden, which means loss aversion does not register it, but it is entirely real. The safe choice is not safe. It is a choice between a certain slow loss and an uncertain but historically positive long-term gain. Understanding this reframes the risk calculation entirely. The fourth barrier is patience mismatch. The wealth-building timeline of asset accumulation operates on a scale that the human reward system was not designed to appreciate. The most powerful compounding happens in years 20 through 40 of an investment period. The visible progress in years 1 through 5 is modest, and in a world of instant gratification, of one-click delivery and immediate feedback loops, a process whose most significant rewards arrive in decades rather than days, operates entirely against the current of what feels motivating. This is why understanding the mathematics of compounding, not just knowing that it exists, but viscerally feeling the numbers, is psychologically important. When you calculate that your current monthly investment will be worth a specific large personal number in 30 years, the reward becomes more real. Not immediate, but real. And real rewards, even future ones, sustain behavior in ways that abstract ones do not.
Chapter 9. The Practical Crossing. How to move from the first world to the second in real life. Everything in this video to this point has been preparing for this chapter, because understanding is valuable, but understanding without a practical path is frustration. The crossing from the first world to the second, from earned income dependence to asset income building, does not happen in a single moment. It happens through a series of deliberate, sequential steps that gradually shift the balance of your financial life from active income to passive income. Let me walk you through the crossing as I understand it, based on the research and the real stories and the principles we have covered. Stage 1. Prepare the foundation. This means eliminating the financial leaks that prevent capital from accumulating. High-interest debt first, because debt above 8 to 10% interest is a negative asset that destroys capital faster than most positive assets can build it. A basic emergency buffer second, because without it, every setback requires debt, and debt prevents capital accumulation. A clear monthly surplus third, a deliberate, known, consistent gap between income and spending that produces capital available for deployment. This foundation stage is not glamorous. It does not feel like asset building. But without it, capital never accumulates in sufficient amounts to deploy. The foundation is the prerequisite. Stage 2. Acquire your first asset. Not the right asset, not the optimal asset. The first one. Something. Anything that fits the definition. Something that puts money in your pocket. For most people starting from zero, this is a small position in a broad market index fund. It might be $50. It might be $500. The amount matters far less than the act, because the act changes your identity. You go from being someone who earns and spends to being someone who owns. And that identity shift, however small it seems in the moment, is the real beginning. Set up automatic monthly contributions to the asset, not when you remember, not when you have spare money, on payday, automatically, before the spending brain sees the money. The automation makes the behavior identity consistent without requiring ongoing willpower. Stage 3. Educate yourself specifically, not generally, specifically in the asset class you are building. If equities, understand how index funds work, what expense ratios are, how to read a basic fund prospectus. If real estate, understand cap rates, cash-on-cash returns, how to evaluate a potential rental property. If business, understand what systemization means, what a business worth owning looks like versus a job you own. The education stage is not separate from the building stage. It happens alongside it. You do not need to be educated before you start. You start and you educate simultaneously. The starting makes the education real, because now you have skin in the game. Now the knowledge has direct application to something you already own. Stage 4. Reinvest everything. Every dividend, every interest payment, every return the asset generates. Do not consume the income from your assets while they are still small. Reinvest it. Allow it to purchase more assets. The compounding of asset income, purchasing additional assets, is how the second world builds momentum. This stage requires a specific psychological reframe. Asset income is not income in the spending sense. It is capital returning to be redeployed. It is the second world feeding itself. The moment you begin consuming asset income for lifestyle expenses, you slow the compounding. Wait until the asset base is large enough that the income it generates genuinely exceeds what you need. Then the consumption is sustainable, because the principal continues growing. Stage 6. Scale deliberately. As income grows, as debt disappears, as the asset base builds, increase the deployment rate. More of each pay raise going to assets rather than lifestyle. More of each surplus going to additional asset acquisition rather than additional consumption.
The scaling is the difference between a modest investment portfolio and a genuinely life-changing asset base. The timeline for this process is measured in years, sometimes in decades. Grace Groner held her 3 shares for 75 years. John Bogle spent a career building Vanguard before its full impact was visible. Carnegie made his first investment as a teenager and sold Carnegie Steel in his mid-60s. The time horizon is long, the path is clear, the compounding is reliable. What is not guaranteed is that you will start. What is not guaranteed is that you will continue when the progress feels slow. What is not guaranteed is that you will hold the course when the market falls, or when consumption temptations appear, or when the immediate gratification of spending feels more real than the abstract promise of compounding. Those guarantees belong to character, to the identity you choose, to whether you decide at some fundamental level that building the second world is something you are doing, not something you might someday consider.
Chapter 10. Making Money Work, the Complete Philosophy. I want to close by bringing everything in this video back to its simplest form, because complexity is where motivation goes to die. And the actual philosophy of making money work for you, stripped of all the case studies and mechanisms and asset class descriptions, is almost embarrassingly simple. Here it is. Every dollar that arrives in your life is a potential worker. Spend it, and it works once, for the seller of whatever you bought, and then it is gone. Deploy it as capital, and it begins working for you. It generates a return. That return generates its own return. The worker multiplies itself, and over time, the army of workers you have deployed does more for your financial life than any amount of labor you could personally perform. The wealthy understand this not as a clever trick, but as a fundamental truth about how financial reality operates. Money left to work grows. Money consumed evaporates. The difference between a wealthy financial life and a struggling one is largely the difference between these two fates of money over decades of repeated daily decisions. Warren Buffett described his approach to spending through what he called the opportunity cost of a purchase. Every dollar he considered spending, he evaluated not just at its face value, but at what that dollar could become if deployed rather than spent. A dollar invested at his historical return rate, held for 30 years, becomes significantly more than a dollar. The true cost of the purchase is not its price. It is its price plus the future value of the return it would have generated. This is not a counsel of miserliness. Buffett was not unhappy. He was not deprived. He lived comfortably, enjoyed his life, ate what he wanted, did what he loved. But he understood at every moment the opportunity cost of consumption, and that understanding made unnecessary consumption feel genuinely unappealing, not through discipline, but through comprehension. Ray Dalio described the same principle differently. He said that the biggest mistake most people make is thinking of savings as deferred consumption, money they are putting aside to spend later. The truly wealthy think of savings as capital, money they are deploying to generate more money. The mental difference is total. One frame produces a modest retirement account. The other produces a financial engine. Oprah Winfrey described her crossing from the first world to the second in terms that were less financial and more psychological, but no less accurate. She said that the moment she stopped spending to manage her feelings and started deploying to build her future was the moment her financial life began to look like something she had chosen rather than something that was happening to her. 3 very different people, 3 very different paths, one principle. Money deployed into assets builds the second world. Money consumed stays in the first. The two sides of money are not equally available to everyone at every moment. Someone in genuine financial crisis cannot deploy capital they do not have. Someone drowning in high-interest debt needs to address that before anything else. The sequence matters, as we have discussed at length in the Blueprint video. But the direction,
The compass bearing that points from the first world towards the second is available to anyone who understands it. And understanding it, even without immediately acting on it, changes how you experience every financial decision from this point forward. You will see the treadmill for what it is, the paycheck for what it offers and what it does not, the lifestyle purchase for its true cost, the asset for its genuine promise. And somewhere in that seeing, in the clarity that comes from understanding the two sides of money at the level we have explored today, the first step becomes possible. Not because you have become someone different, because you now see something you could not see before. The second world is not a secret. It is not reserved. It does not require wealth to enter, only the willingness to make the first small, deliberate deployment of capital towards ownership rather than consumption. That willingness is available to you right now. If this video gave you that clarity, if the two sides of money look different to you now than they did at the beginning, share it with one person whose financial life it might change. That conversation might be the most valuable thing you do with the next 5 minutes. Thank you for spending this time with me. The next video goes deep into the mechanics of investing simply, how ordinary people with ordinary incomes build wealth through the most boring and most effective investment strategy ever documented. I'll see you there.